And now, our feature presentation.
What is Daikatana? It's a cautionary tale, a tale of hubris, something we may not all look back fondly upon, but something we can all appreciate for various reasons. I mean, let's face it, if a game like Daikatana came out today, it would be fixed in 6 months and the Steam reviews would have gone from mixed to mostly positive. But back in 2000, we didn't have such luxuries. I think what's important to remember is that underneath all the history and all the nonsense and all the bullshit is that Daikatana is a very cool game with a lot of very cool ideas. And we should all be glad it exists as a part of video game history, even as a cautionary tale. You know, what is FPS history without Daikatana? It's a lot more boring, that's for sure. Bitch.
Sometimes you have to tell yourself, enough is enough. In the research and writing that I've done for the background information on this documentary, I've discovered one of the most, if not the most, documented game development cycles in the history of computer gaming. Now, part of this might be because of the high-stakes drama that erupted behind the scenes during this period of time. There were magazine articles, newspaper reports, forum posts, developer logs and notes, even leaked emails caught the attention of not just the tightly knit circles of PC gamers, but the general public as well. You see, the topic of this documentary, John Romero's Daikatana, is arguably the biggest flop in computer gaming of all time. There was hype, there was promise, there was interest, there was backlash, there was infighting and outfighting. The development of Daikatana signaled the rise of game developers as rock stars, not just known names within the medium that they worked in, but as singular personalities larger than life that drew the attention of the outside media at large. And in the period of the late 90s, no game developer was as seen, heard, or paid attention to as John Romero. There was no game that was as ready to be pounced upon by the public as his 2000 release, his magnum opus. And there was no game that was as quickly and thoroughly left behind to the annals of history and the whispers and myths of just how terrible the game was to experience. Before we continue, I want to take a second to establish the purpose of this documentary. There's plenty of video essays on the subject of Daikatana, most of which primarily focus on whether or not the game is as devastatingly terrible as the game's reputation suggests. Spoiler alert, it isn't. So I didn't want to go into this video to simply talk about the game, or defend the game, or go over its many flaws one by one. No, I wanted to talk about the creation of the game. More specifically, the environment the game was created in, and the goings-on surrounding said environment. Because while many have skirted over and around the dramatic clash of egos at Romero's development company, Ion Storm, I've yet to see anyone put into context how all of this affected Romero and the development of Daikatana. And believe me, there was an impact on development. But like with any story about anything that happens in real life, this is a story that involves real people. Real, actual humans who may or may not end up watching this video about events that they took part in 25 years ago. This is a story of hubris, ego, vitriol, arrogance, pride, and some misogyny thrown in for good measure. Some of the events that I'm going to talk about get a little ugly. There's no small amount of bad behavior behind the scenes here, and some of the people involved might not be presented in a very flattering light. Normally, you'd hear the word allegedly used a lot in a presentation such as this, but outside of one or two instances, you're not going to hear that from me. mostly because all of this actually happened, outside of varying details that no one seems to agree on. There are sometimes very different perspectives on when certain events happened, but said events still actually happened. For example, one source says a particular advertisement ran in April of 1997. Another says June of 1997, but all evidence points to the fact that the magazines didn't run the ad until December of 1997. That said, I'm not here to cast judgment or make anyone look bad. I'm also not going to attempt to excuse or justify any bad behavior. What I am here to do is examine multiple perspectives from multiple documented resources, layer them over each other, and present them in what I think is as close to the truth of what transpired. I'm sure there will be a few voices who end up sliding into the comments to say, hey, that's not exactly how that happened. And I welcome that, because I wouldn't have gone through all the effort that I have to find clear answers if I didn't welcome that. I have spent 4 months ensconced in Daikatana. I've played the game 4 times, I've played the console ports, I've played the prototypes and the alpha builds. I've compiled over 40 hours of footage to be used for this video. I've read and reread 1 biography, 1 autobiography, a strategy guide, a comic book, and countless articles and interviews surrounding this game. I've even asked a few special guests to come in and provide some fun little sound bites on how they feel about the game's impact, which will be peppered throughout the documentary. It was an interesting experience just rounding up some of these guests, because you would think that a game of Daikatana's reputation would have been played by quite a few people. And yet, the more developers and content creators that I spoke to, the more I discovered that the game's reputation precedes it to such a degree that I had a difficult time finding people who so much as sat down with it, which feels like an absolute shame. There is so much information to be discovered, so many fascinating and interesting points and perspectives to speak on, that I could probably no doubt spend another 4 months collecting and researching all of it. But where I am at this point, I'm learning that sometimes you have to stop yourself and say, enough is enough. It's literally impossible for me to include everything, every detail, every piece of evidence and information. So, after driving myself nearly to the point of exhaustion, and coming down literally to the wire with this project, if there's any lesson I can derive from what I've researched, it's that sometimes you have to know when to stop pushing further. So, with that said, I think it's time that I wrap up this intro and we take a hard, long look at the hard, long road of the development of Daikatana. It's a journey that takes place over the course of 10 years and begins probably where you would least expect it, with a group of young game developers playing Dungeons and Dragons. But before we get to that, let's talk a little bit about the origins of the man behind the game, John Romero himself. John Romero has been fighting since day one. Born 6 weeks premature on October 28, 1967, Alfonso John Romero grew up in Tucson, Arizona, born to parents Ginny and Alfonso Antonio Romero. John's father, Alfonso, was a stern man and an alcoholic. The family was poor. Sometimes, Alfonso would rob convenience stores at gunpoint in order to procure diapers for John and his younger brother, Ralph. When he wasn't at work, Alfonso would oftentimes descend into abusive behavior while in the throes of his alcoholism, including an incident where he drove John and Ralph out into the middle of the desert and simply left them there. John was 6. Ralph was 4. One day, Alfonso left and didn't return home. John's mother, Ginny, would meet a military man, remarry, and then they would move out to Northern California. John's stepfather was a very stern man who believed that he knew what was best for John, and that meant keeping him away from video games. As a child, John was obsessed with computers and arcade games. He loved them. He would sneak away and lie about where he was going to meet up with friends at the arcade, something his stepfather was deeply resistant to. But John refused to back down. He started programming games on an Apple II that he purchased in 1980, and by 1987, had an industry job working at Origin Systems. One gig led to another until 1990 in Shreveport, Louisiana, where John was working for Soft Disc Publishing on a monthly game disc called Gamer's Edge. By this point in time, he had met and assembled with John Carmack, Tom Hall, and Adrian Carmack. All of them worked together to produce Gamer's Edge, and were part of a dev team called Ideas from the Deep, founded originally by John and his friend Lane Roth. John had fought his way through an abusive childhood and all the barriers that life could place to prevent him from learning how to work with computers. Now, up until this point, I've been referring to John Romero as simply John, but since the next segment is going to heavily feature John Carmack as well, in order to lessen confusion, I'm going to refer to Romero and Carmack by their last names for the remainder of the documentary. In 1990, while working at Softdisk, Romero, Carmack, Adrian, and Tom developed a game called Commander Keen for Apogee Software. The first entry in the series was titled Commander Keen in Invasion of the Vorticons. At the end of the game's final episode, a message teased the group's next game, Quake, The Fight for Justice. The game would be based on a character from a Dungeons & Dragons campaign that Carmack had been developing with detailed lore and background for years. The group would play through the campaign in their off time. Carmack ran the sessions as the DM, and the rest of the crew campaigned as warriors who worked for a group called Justice. The character of Quake was an unstoppable force of power, with a hammer of thunderbolts, a ring of regeneration, and a Hellgate Cube companion, which would absorb the souls of his enemies. The boys were excited to create a game based around this concept, but realized that the technology they needed in order to make it come to life was not quite within their reach, so they shelved it for the time being and moved on to other projects. 1991. After leaving Softdisk and forming id Software, Carmack, Romero, and the rest of the team have more time to devote to their weekly D&D sessions. At one point in the campaign, Romero decided to steal a book called the Demonomicron, a tome which could be used to summon demons from the Hell Plane over into the Material Plane. He wanted to use it for the purpose of discovering more powerful weapons for the group, such as the highly sought-after Sword of Power, a legendary blade known as the Daikatana. 1992. While id Software is in the midst of getting ready to start work on what will become Wolfenstein 3D, Romero decided to experiment with the Demonomicron in their D&D campaign. Carmack was a little unnerved by this decision because he understood the true power of the tome, which could potentially literally destroy the entire world of the campaign that he had been developing up to that point. But Carmack, rather than warn off Romero from making the choice to do so, was curious just how far Romero was willing to push against the boundaries of safety in the game. During the campaign, a powerful demon appeared before the group, offering Romero's character a trade: hand over the Demonomicron, and the demon would gift him the Daikatana as a reward. The rest of the group tried to get Romero to see reason. It was a demon, for God's sake. The damn thing couldn't be trusted. It was an obvious trap. The Daikatana wasn't worth the risk. However, Romero weighed the options and decided that the power of the Daikatana would enable him and the rest of the party to defeat the demon immediately afterward. So he made the trade. Carmack then rolled the dice to see what the demon's response would be, and the dice roll landed on the demon, summoning armies of lesser demons into the material plane. Over the course of the next few game nights, Romero and company valiantly fought back against the armies, with Romero banking on the power of the Daikatana to win the day, but they lost. The world was destroyed. The campaign was over. Romero, shaken, asked Carmack if they could have a do-over, but Carmack's word was final. There was no going back from the end of the world. After the release of Wolfenstein, Carmack came up with an idea. What if they took that finale from their D&D sessions and adapted it into a new game? The idea of demons crossing over into the realm of reality was genius. And just like that, the concept of Doom was conceived. Doom was released on December 10th, 1993 to overwhelmingly positive critical and commercial success. The rest, as they say, is history. In 1994, after the release of Doom 2, id Software sat down to discuss their next project. Carmack announced that he was going to begin working on a new, fully 3D game engine with hefty multiplayer support, an announcement which caused an excited Romero to shout,
"We can finally make Quake."
Newer id Software members, such as Sandy Peterson and American McGee, are unfamiliar with the game idea, so Romero explained the concept, miming and acting out epic combat with hammers and dragons. Based on this, the team was sold, and based on their reaction, Carmack agreed that Quake should be their next game. But at this point in time, Romero and Carmack were beginning to move down separate pathways as to the direction of the studio. Where Carmack was a dedicated workhorse who only wanted to put nose to the grindstone, Romero was diversifying the company, giving interviews, and involving himself in deathmatch games. Romero had only made 6 out of the 32 maps for Doom 2, but he had been busy approaching other studios to see who wanted to potentially license out the Doom engine. Romero had also acted as producer on a game called Heretic, developed by Raven Software, a project which Romero had worked very closely on during development, where Romero wanted to be able to enjoy the success that id Software had worked so hard to achieve and leave behind the death schedule that they had employed in the past. Carmack saw a lack of motivation to work. Here we should note the birth of a persona known by many around the time as the Romero, a flashy, braggadocious, arrogant version of John Romero, one who talked trash in death matches because he knew he had the skill to get away with it, who made lofty promises about id's games in interviews and online. On one hand, John Romero the person was soft-spoken, gentle, funny, awkward, even non-confrontational behind closed doors. But on a public platform, there was a different persona, the trash talker, the rogue variable, the unstoppable force. A man who had spent his life trying to prove himself, fighting against the powers that be who stood in the way of his success in computer games, and now, at last, have reached the top. This was the Romero, and not everyone was enamored with the Romero.
I think if you were into gaming back then, it was kind of hard to not be aware of Daikatana when it was in development, simply because it seemed that everyone was pushing it out there as this brand spanking new release coming from John Romero, one of the guys who worked on Doom and Quake. And I was also a huge fan of Romero and its software, even from their earlier days, with stuff like Commander Keen and Dangerous Dave. So yeah, I was pretty hyped for this thing. Then of course it came out, and yeah, we all know how that went. It is an interesting case study though, simply because it really was a forward-thinking premise for a video game at the time, being this epic experience where you had AI-controlled characters that helped you out almost the entire thing. It's just that it was conceived at a time before the technology felt like it was able to incorporate that idea properly. I do remember playing it on launch as well, and it being absolutely broken in certain areas, but you could definitely see the potential the whole thing had. I mean, even just that basic concept alone is awesome. Hopping into different time periods with a magical katana as you track down this power-hungry warlord, which also gave Romero an excuse to completely change up the weapons, enemies, and art style with each episode and not have to justify it. So yeah, I don't quite think it's the worstest FPS game ever made, despite what some people might say about it, but it is definitely one of the most interesting ones to look back on.
1995. Carmack and Romero sat down to discuss design elements for Quake and whether or not they would work within the potential scope of the engine. The two languages of the engine would be Quake C, the code, and Quake Ed, the editing tools. But Romero couldn't completely write Quake Ed until Quake C was finished, meaning he wouldn't be able to program all the necessary tools for editing without knowing what the engine was capable of allowing. Romero had enough of a skeleton to be able to get the project started. Meanwhile, Carmack contracted a studio called Cygnus to make a game using the Doom engine, similar to Romero's deal with Raven on Heretic. Romero bounced back and forth between programming Quake Ed, directing Ultimate Doom and creating maps for it, starting Heretic 2, and overseeing the post-launch direction for Doom 2 and Heretic. As Carmack toiled over the Quake engine with Michael Abrash, Romero kept the design team of id active doing busy work. Adrian worked on a series of different textures from different eras for the proposed time travel exploits, as well as the color palette of the game. Sandy and American utilized the still rudimentary Quake Ed and Adrian's textures to learn how to design in 3D, but the results were minimal at best. Adding to this frustration was the fact that the team had never worked with 3D models before, all while they followed a minimalistic 2-page design document provided by Romero. However, Romero could only do so much work on Quake Ed without the finished Quake C, so he didn't have much more for the team to work with. August 1995. A frazzled Carmack assembles the id team and hands out reports to everyone based on their performance thus far on Quake, something he'd never done before. Romero got a C. Out of earshot, Romero and the rest of the team made excuses for Carmack's bizarre choice of approach for feedback, attempting to recognize the amount of pressure that he was under. Romero, meanwhile, was working on multiple projects, not just Quake. He knew the only way to offload the work in order to put more focus on Quake was to hire more people, but this was something that Carmack was against. In an attempt to re-energize both the team and their fans, Romero released 16 screenshots to the internet of work done thus far, which was met with high praise. However, Sandy Peterson decided to go directly to Carmack and complain about Romero's ineffective leadership. Despite his misgivings with Romero's new approach to development, Carmack initially dismissed Sandy's criticism. Carmack, at this point, has worked with Romero long enough to know that he would put it all together in the end, despite the current state of affairs. September 1995. Quake's engine has been in development for 10 months. The design team was in a creative cabin fever, making R&D levels, tweaking the sound engine. American became fully invested in the music of the game, and spent a lot of time in New Orleans with the band 9 Inch Nails, who had agreed to create the game's soundtrack and the sound effects. During this time, Cygnus Studios were having difficulties producing Strife. Studio head Scott Host had written a program to track his employees' work hours, which they understandably balked at. 3 of the devs, Jim Molinitz, Rich Fleeter, and Tim Naveau, wanted out of the project, but also wanted to continue developing the game under a new studio that they were going to create. Romero felt that this was a good idea to support, and the others at id agreed. The contract with Cygnus was cancelled, and the new studio, dubbed Rogue Entertainment, picked up where they left off. Simultaneously, Adrian spent a full month crafting Aztec-inspired textures for American to work with. But American didn't feel inspired by them. He preferred to work with more industrial, darker, black metal textures for his maps in the game, negating all that work. Adrian and Kevin Cloud are fed up with making textures aimlessly. Romero, meanwhile, was still giving generalized directions to the team. He didn't have much more to provide here, but he trusted Carmack's process. To Romero, it had always worked like this, and therefore he felt like it would continue to work. Romero kept telling himself that not every member of id had been around long enough to trust Carmack's process. Part of this process, however, was Carmack moving his desk out of the office and into the hallway in order to keep a better eye on production. By now, however, considering the amount of work necessary for juggling multiple projects, Carmack finally agreed to bringing in a new hire for marketing, Mike Wilson. Mike had been working as the vice president of development for Dwango, or Dial-Up Wide Arena Network Game Operation. Dwango was an early online gaming service provider for multiplayer matchmaking, an absolutely influential service not only for the time, but in computer gaming history. Mike Wilson was a biz guy, and when id Software came calling, he saw numbers and wanted in. After getting the job, Mike immediately set about crafting a practical joke in the office to lighten everyone's moods. He hired a stripper to come down to the office and deliver pizza while topless, but this backfired. Everyone was so invested in their work, and none of them had actually ordered a pizza, so the half-naked woman was met with complete disinterest. On her way out the door, the stripper called the devs, quote, boring as hell. October 20th, 1995. Carmack called a meeting with Romero, Adrian, and Kevin. Carmack issued a come-to-Jesus message to Romero in the form of a formal warning. Carmack believed that Romero wasn't working hard enough on Quake. Romero, confused, countered with all the work he had been doing. He'd been insulating the company to maintain cash inflow through Heretic, Hexen, Ultimate Doom, and Strife. Carmack doubled down that Romero wasn't focused enough on Quake itself. Adrian and Kevin back Romero and tell Carmack that Romero was doing plenty of work within the company. They refused to back Carmack's formal warning. Now, Carmack relented, but he stressed that Romero's bonus would be lessened because he wasn't working entirely on Quake's design. Despite Romero's protests, there wasn't enough for the design team to do because there wasn't enough of the engine to work with. Romero accepted his fate and the lowered bonus. November 1995. After close to a year of development, the Quake engine was done at last. Romero and Carmack held a meeting with the entire team. Romero was excited to dig into proper design work for the game, but the rest of the team was exhausted from doing next to nothing for nearly a year. They were unhappy with some of the design gimmicks, such as Quake's hammer, and they'd only been making Doom-style maps during the entirety of the process with little input on anything else. It's what they know. They're too burned out and frustrated to try and reinvent the wheel. American speaks up and suggests sticking to the Doom format. Sandy even suggests turning what they've got into Doom 3, innovating with their next game instead. Romero tries to rally the troops, reminding them that this is how it's always worked at id Software. Carmack toils over a game engine, and then when it's done, the design team comes in and creates magic with it. And as for the hammer, it was an essential part of the game experience, something that they had been talking about and had even been featured on the cover of PC Gamer as part of their announcement of the game. Carmack, however, didn't immediately back Romero. He could see the pros and cons to both tracks, to pushing forward with innovative design, but also in sticking with the tried and true measures to save time and resources. Adrian and Kevin gently agree with Romero, but they're also tired. Romero was stunned. This wasn't what he wanted, or how they had done things before. He didn't want to just make the same game again and again, and the idea of just making another Doom-style game filled him with fatigue. However, Romero admitted defeat, and he agreed to turn Quake into a Doom-style first-person shooter, abandoning the majestic design plans that he'd had for the game. Sandy is pulled away from helping produce Strife in order to focus entirely on Quake, and one of Strife's level designers, Tim Willits, is added to the team to help handle the load. By mid-December, Romero had reworked Quake's design document around this new direction, but inside, he'd already decided that this would be his last game with id. If this was going to be the way of things moving forward, he didn't want any part of it. He wanted to innovate on the design, not just the technology. January 1996. The team start working 18-hour days in full crunch mode. Carmack ordered the walls of the cubicles to be torn down in order for everyone to be able to see each other working, dubbing the area the War Room. Tensions mounted, and hostilities increased as new hire Willits was pumping out maps at an impressive rate. So much so that a clearly pleased Carmack decided that Willits' maps would be the ones featured in Quake's shareware release. Romero balked at this decision. He was the lead designer, it ought to be his maps featured in the shareware. But Carmack's mind was set. Late one night, Romero called up old friend and former coworker Tom Hall. Tom had left id after experiencing similar issues that Romero was currently facing, and Romero informed him that he was going to leave id after Quake. Romero muses that he wants to start up his own studio, one where the design drives the games, not the tech. He asks Tom if he would want to be a part of that studio. Tom replies, "That would be the dream." June 22nd, 1996, Quake releases. Alone in the office, Romero uploads the shareware version to the server for fans to download, and the reception is immediately ecstatic. Despite all the issues of development, Romero was proud of the game. He took a 2-week vacation to reset and then returned to the office to work on mastering the CD-ROM of the shareware. He also had a meeting with Gabe Newell and Mike Harrington to talk about their new company, Valve. Romero gave them tips and tricks on design and studio function, and gave them a copy of Quake's source code to play around with. August 5th, 1996. Still tossing around ideas about his dream studio, Romero called up Ron Chamowitz at GT Interactive. GTI had published the retail versions of Doom, Doom 2, and Final Doom, along with Heretic and Hexen, and they would ultimately publish the retail version of Quake. Mike Wilson had organized the idea of id sending out copies of Quake's shareware on a CD-ROM, which would contain the full game locked behind a code, so gamers interested in unlocking the full game without wanting to wait for a retail box release could just call up id, pay $50, and then have the code to unlock the game. This had resulted in lower retail sales for GT, but more money for id. Romero had always enjoyed the business partnership with GT, and he chatted with Ron about a potential new studio, Dream Design, to see if there would be interest in GT in funding the project. Now, unbeknownst to Romero, at that same time, Carmack was meeting with Adrian and Kevin for lunch, convincing them that Romero had been a troublesome presence at id, and that it was time for him to go. Adrian and Kevin, despite their friendship with Romero, didn't have a way to argue with Carmack. August 6th, 1996. Carmack calls Romero in to meet with him, Adrian, and Kevin, and then the ball dropped. Carmack told Romero that his actions within the last year had been toxic for id, damaging the company, and then Carmack holds out resignation papers, demanding that Romero sign them. Romero, of course, refuses to back down, reminding everyone that he's been busting his ass for the past 7 months after the engine had been finished to get Quake over the finish line. He's been doing the work, handling design, handling production of external games that provide capital for the company. How was that toxic? But Carmack doubled down and told Romero that not only had he not been doing the work, he'd been poisonous to the company and hindering overall production. Both Adrian and Kevin are silent, knowing that they're there to support Carmack's decision, but neither of them wanted to. Romero, as he saw it, was going to leave the company anyway. He'd made up his mind. This was just the instigating action. And in his head, the timing of the meeting after just talking to GT Interactive couldn't have been a coincidence. To him, someone must have talked to Carmack about it. Relenting, Romero signed the resignation papers and then saw himself out. August 7th, 1996. Romero called Tom Hall to let him know that he has left id Software. Tom, at that time, was working at 3D Realms on a game called Prey. Tom had been having his own design difficulties and was eager to work with Romero again. Tom delivered his 2-week notice to 3D Realms. Romero posted a .plan file announcing his departure from id Software and his intention to start a new development company. In his own .plan, Carmack also announced Romero's departure from id. To talk about the breakup of id Software in such light terms nowadays makes the event almost seem trivial. It really wasn't. Civi said it the best in one of his videos.
Seeing this happen to id Software was like seeing the Beatles break up. Romero may have been shirking his duties, but something was clearly lost after Quake. A power dynamic shifted. It was about the technology now.
Fans were caught off guard, but knowing Romero the way that they did, they were also genuinely intrigued for whatever he was concocting behind the scenes.
Everyone who's wanted to make games or enjoys playing games will probably end up with a story or two about an incredibly cool sounding concept that slowly has layer upon layer of potentially awesome ideas stacked on top of it over time. And when it comes time to actually put it all together, it falls apart spectacularly. But for some reason, some of those ideas still shine through, and you get this strange mess of unintentional comedy and a lot of charm. That, to me, is Daikatana. I grew up in a Mac household, so it wasn't until quite a bit later that I actually had a PC powerful enough to game on. I decided to give Daikatana a try, and I was really not feeling that first level with the AI companion and the swamp and all the mosquitoes. So I decided to just no-clip around the environments and just kind of take in the atmosphere and the artwork. And honestly, that was the best experience I could have had with it, because there is a lot of charm in this game. It's a lot like Redneck Rampage for me. I still like to go through occasionally and just kind of look at things.
September 29th, 1996. A young woman named Stevie Case, under the moniker Kill Creek, entered the Clan Ring tournament and led her team, Impulse 9, to victory. Stevie was a fighter. Much like Romero, she had been her entire life. Born Stevana Case, Stevie grew up in Olathe, Kansas, and at a young age found herself the only girl on the t-ball team. Furious parents demanded that she play with the other girls. Coaches wouldn't let her play umpire when it was her turn in rotation. For Stevie, none of this made any sense. She was just showing up to play the game like everyone else was. High school saw her continue to swing for the fences. She was voted class president and athlete of the year. She even successfully sued the state of Kansas in federal court in conjunction with the ACLU. The case, Case v. Unified School District, involved the school district banning a 1982 novel, Annie on My Mind, which was about a lesbian relationship between two 17-year-old girls. The case went to trial in November of 1995, and the ACLU eventually won. For Stevie, her dream job had always been the office of the President of the United States of America. In an interview with Vanity Fair, Stevie said, "I always wanted to be president, nothing lower." In 1996, Stevie had been enrolled at the University of Kansas, working towards a law degree to help her achieve just that. Then Quake came out. She had been living on the honors dorm floor, and all the nerdy residents couldn't stop talking about Quake. Intrigued, she accepted an invitation to come play with the boys, and she was instantly hooked. The speed, the thrills, the action drew her in. Stevie found herself entranced by the game. The darkened hallways and monsters, little more than fodder for her rocket launcher. Deathmatch was where she truly came to life, however. Multiple wins and multiple competitions had overtaken her desires to become a lawyer. She chose the name Kill Creek as her online moniker, taken from a local grunge band that she couldn't stop listening to. Here, with Quake, she'd finally found her people. Yes, she was still the only girl that she knew playing the game, still deeply entrenched in boys' territory, but in the gamer community, she didn't feel like an outsider. She felt like part of the team. With the Clan Ring victory under her belt, Stevie felt the call of Quake even more, and decided to throw everything she had into being a professional gamer. Fall 1996. Romero and Tom start making the rounds to pitch their new studio, Dream Design, to publishers. They're given lavish treatment and are wooed by Activision, Epic, and Origin. In each round of meetings, Romero says the same thing. Their goal was to have 3 big-name developers working on 3 games at the same time in 3 different genres, led by a single mantra: design is law. Their terms for potential funding were a $3 million budget for each game in production, 40% royalty for the devs, and the rights to their own IP. At the time, this wasn't exactly over the top or unheard of. Multiple vanity studios based around the name of the lead developer had already been established and were making great games. Sid Meier's Firaxis, Chris Roberts' Digital Anvil, Richard Garriott's Origin, Will Wright's Maxis. As Romero and Tom continued their tour, they started searching for a third developer to sign up with them and produce that third game promised in pitch sessions. A chance visit to 7th level to see developer Mike Maynard resulted in meeting with Todd Porter, According to a bio written up by the Dallas Observer, Todd was a self-taught programmer, born in Chicago, and had attended Central College in Pella, Iowa for 3 years before he decided to drop out and work in computer gaming. Porter was a myth maker, a self-promoter, someone who had a knack for landing on his feet. His previous company, Distant Thunder, was a development studio consisting of himself and artist Jerry O'Flaherty. In 1994, Todd borrowed $30,000 from a software industry investor named Stephen Kennedy in order to get Distant Thunder off the ground. Rather than deliver a game as intended, Todd had blown through the money, as well as through a $240,000 advance from Merit Software. Distant Thunder was close to closing its doors when publisher 7th Level came in and saved the day. In February 1995, Todd and Jerry sold the company to 7th Level for $1.5 million. Todd got 70%. Todd then produced a game called Genome, an interesting little title which sought to stand out in the burgeoning mech warrior genre. It flopped. This, however, did not stop Todd from starting work on a soft sequel titled Dominion: Storm Over Gift 3, a real-time strategy game. Todd was a bit of a standout amongst other devs, taking himself seriously by wearing business suits to meetings, a little outside of the current gamer culture of ripped jeans and sneakers. Romero and Tom both liked the idea of bringing on someone who had experience with real-time strategy, as it was a very different genre from what the two of them had been working on. Todd was also keen on the idea, but he wanted to bring along Jerry as art director. Romero and Tom agreed. Now, by this time, Romero thought that the name Dream Design was too soft for the kind of studio that they were attempting to establish. This was an era of single-word, edgy, attention-grabbing studio names, slicing through gamer attention spans to inform the audience that this team was not fucking around. Romero, Tom, Todd, and Jerry sit down at lunch to discuss the name, along with Key Kimbrell, a programmer who had co-founded Dwango. Key was on the phone as a part of the meeting, interested in joining the team, but still not yet sold. Tom suggested the name Ion, which Romero wanted, but then they found that it was a name already registered in domains. Something needed to be added onto it. Key chuckled and joked that their competition should watch out, or they would find themselves caught up in an ion storm. Romero seized the name. That had to be it. On November 15th, 1996, Ion Storm is founded by John Romero, Tom Hall, Todd Porter, and Jerry O'Flaherty, all with equal ownership in the company. After this, the courting tour continued with visits to Acclaim, Virgin, and even a stop at GT Interactive. After all, Romero had had what he thought were really good talks with the publisher before all of this had started, and hoped that there would be a door open for him still, but he wasn't impressed with the goings-on at GTI during their visit, so he decided against it. Christmas Eve 1996. The team meets with IDOS Interactive and land on a solid deal. Ion Storm gets paid the $3 million for each of their first 3 games, plus $4 million for console rights, and IDOS got first option on Ion Storm's next 3 games after their current lineup. The total package was valued at around $100 million. Sean Green from id Software came aboard as a programmer. Bob Wright was hired as the company's COO, and Mike Wilson is snagged from id Software to be the company's CEO. Romero, Tom, and Todd outlined their games. Tom's game is Anachronox, a tongue-in-cheek sci-fi RPG set in outer space. Todd's game is Doppelganger, a real-time strategy game where the enemy was body-snatching slugs. And Romero, his game is going to be a first-person shooter titled Daikatana, named after the sword from id's past D&D games. He felt that he could take that previous failure in gaming and turn it around into a monument of game design. Drawing inspiration from Chrono Trigger and Legend of Zelda, Romero envisioned an epic time travel story with a deep narrative. The protagonist of the game would be Hiro Miyamoto, named in honor of Nintendo's Shigeru Miyamoto, and players would progress through 4 different eras of time, searching for the legendary sword Daikatana in order to defeat a time-traveling madman. Hiro was envisioned as a 25th century biochemistry student tasked with the burden of being the chosen one to wield the Sword of Power, steadily growing stronger over the course of the game. Players would have RPG skills and stats to level up in order to become stronger, and there would be 2 AI companion characters that they could order around to help them during combat. Each time period would feature unique weapons and unique monsters to fight. Romero initially wanted to push the design even further into more complex combat and exploration, but understood that it would be gentler to design the RPG game around first-person shooting mechanics, taking lessons from the development of Quake. Around this time, Romero heard about a female gamer named Kill Creek, who a mutual acquaintance felt might actually be able to beat Romero in a one-on-one deathmatch. Romero didn't buy it. A girl beating him at his own game? But he was intrigued, and he wanted to set up the match. Stevie, bewildered at the opportunity, excitedly agreed and traveled to Dallas for the event. On an interesting note, as Stevie Case tells the story, in meeting Romero before the match, she was struck by how quiet and gentle and even somewhat awkward Romero was in person, not the rowdy gamer god that she had expected to see. Then, during the match, her expectations were met. The Romero became animated, slinging taunts and trash talk left and right with boisterous bravado and cackling after each kill. Romero won the match, but after the match, the Romero faded away, and John Romero returned to his more calm demeanor. Afterwards online, there was yet another persona switch. The Romero praised her performance between bouts of trash talk about not losing to females, and said that he was down for a rematch anytime. February 1997. Understanding that the proposed complexity of Daikatana meant that he couldn't tackle the game as a solo project, Romero started building a team. He snagged a number of Doom modders and mappers from the modding scene, basing his choices on their passion rather than on their experience, wanting to provide the same opportunities that he'd had when he was a relatively new developer in the gaming circles. John Anderson, Matt Hooper, Steve Resco, and Sverre Kvernmo were brought on board. For sound design, he got Will Lecanto from Information Society's touring band, and finally lured Key Kimbrell away from Dwango to do programming. Romero reached out to id Software to license the Quake engine for a number of reasons. He believed it was still the most powerful and versatile game engine on the market, he was already familiar with it, and it would prevent the slowdown of production by developing an in-house engine. March 1997. Daikatana entered full production with a team of 30. Romero, confident that the size of his team and his familiarity with the game engine will speed production along, announced that he would have the game ready for a Christmas release of that same year. Wanting to set Daikatana apart amidst the growing graphical arms race, he decided to emphasize the narrative design of the game as a priority, since many shooters of the time were more focused on graphics. In a 2002 article, A Hardcore Elegy for Ion Storm, Christian Divine, yes, that Christian Divine, recalled that Romero specifically wanted the story to have, quote, the epic quality of the Final Fantasy games, that unique brand of anime science fantasy romanticism. Divine, a friend of Romero since childhood, had been brought on early in development to help with the game's writing. According to Divine, Romero knew that the shooter genre would have to evolve beyond simply blowing shit up and learn how to embrace deep narrative storytelling. One of Divine's contributions to the story would be naming Superfly Johnson, although the character's original last name was Williams. Divine wanted the character to be more than a stereotype, someone who would discover his French heritage through buried documents in an apocalyptic landscape. Divine defended the name Superfly, citing the 1972 film of the same name, something which was supported by the 25th anniversary re-release of the film's soundtrack. However, Superfly's surname would be changed to Johnson midway through development, and his dialogue would be replaced with a number of stereotypical slang terms. Around this time, Stevie Case accepted Romero's invite for a deathmatch rematch, and the two sat down once again. This time, in a best out of 3 match, Romero let loose a few sexist taunts while playing, and something inside Stevie snapped. She'd been through that kind of rhetoric in the past, playing t-ball, excelling as an athlete, and she wasn't about to stand for it now. In a thorough routing, Stevie came back to win the second round and then demolished Romero in the third. After this, the Romero came out in full theatricality. He grabbed a hammer conveniently set near his keyboard and hammered away at it out of anger until it was little more than decimated plastic and circuitry. He then tossed the demolished keyboard to the side and retrieved a new one. After the match, true to his word, Romero uploaded a shrine to the internet in Stevie's honor, once again praising her deathmatching skills, with the choice phrase, "Put some cream on it, mommy." Stevie, emboldened by her win and the sudden internet celebrity that came with it, decided to drop out of college and move to Dallas, which was quickly becoming the new computer gaming mecca. March 21st, 1997. Romero compiles the Daikatana pre-alpha to show off work in progress. Despite Daikatana having only entered full production earlier that month, Romero has been hard at work over the previous months putting together textures and models for this pre-alpha. This version has only 2 maps to show off, E1M3 and E2M3, from the future Japan and ancient Greece eras respectively. In a note that Romero included with the files when he eventually uploaded this pre-alpha to the internet in 2004, Romero said,
This is the earliest version of Daikatana that exists. It's only 2 months in development and only has 2 levels started. I began writing the design document, GDD, for Daikatana in February 1997, while my first few programmers were learning the Quake tech. Key Kimbrell, Sean Green, and Jonathan Wright. Matt Hooper, Debug, and John Anderson, Dr. Sleep, were making levels. Searching the directory structure, you'll be able to see by the config files who was working on the team back then. Myself, Noel Stevens, programming, Sean Green, programming, Matt Hooper, map design, and Bill Natalini, testing. The real treasure trove of this version lies in the graphic files you'll find in the data/skins directory and data sprites directory. These are pure shit. Just look at these awful graphics. The furry boots, the rat, the buboid, etc. All just awful work. None of these skins made it into the final.
April 1997. Mike Wilson approached Romero with a plan for an ad. The infamous John Romero's about to make you his bitch ad. The purpose of the ad was to capitalize on Romero's famous trash talking during Deathmatch and aim it at the audience. At first, Romero thought it was funny, but after weighing on it for a moment, felt unsure. The ad itself focused more on him and his name than it did on his game. On top of that, it wasn't the kind of phrase that Romero would use in his trash talk. As a response, Mike said, "Don't be a pussy," and after some hemming and hawing, Romero relented and he agreed to run the ad. Mike then sends Romero and Tom out on a whirlwind no excuses tour, dubbed so because they have to sell the company and the games and make no excuses for it. They have interviews with Time, Newsweek, Computer Gaming World, Wall Street Journal, and Fortune. Around this time, the Romero began coming out more and more, basking in his celebrity, dressing in tighter clothing and more jewelry, with larger and more braggadocious statements. Amongst themselves, however, Romero and Hall began to worry that their posturing might present the wrong idea, as all the interviews were focused more on their names rather than the games which they had yet to produce. Furthering this worry was that Todd wanted to be part of the spotlight as well, unhappy that it was only Romero and Tom out in the headlines. Still, the Romero shines full force, selling Ion Storm and his Daikatana on the horizon. Articles were positive, and people were singing Ion Storm's praises, confident in the golden boy essence of Romero and the talent at his company. Romero hired more people from the modding community to work on Daikatana, again based strictly on passion for design.
I think Daikatana was a little ahead of its time, with 2 companions that follow you around, even if some of the features introduced around those characters and the gameplay as a whole were a little unpolished, to say the least. I think it's kind of like Duke Nukem Forever's viewed today. It's kind of still a good game, but still also has a ton of issues, and definitely did not live up to the hype. It's kind of impressive that it even came out. Nonetheless, I think it's still a relatively fun game with a lot of really interesting and cool concepts. And I think its marketing is absolutely legendary. John Romero made everyone his bitch, right? Especially Sandy Peterson. I feel like that's a regular thing nowadays. Daikatana, like I said, it has a lot of issues, but it also is a lot of fun. It has a lot of potential, but I think it's easier to view Daikatana as what it is today than you could have when it released, because when it released, it didn't look as good, play as good as most of the things that were out, even if it did do some things pretty unique that we wouldn't see for many years later, whereas nowadays it just looks and feels the same as most older first-person shooters from the time or from before. So maybe at the time it was a disappointment, much like a Duke Nukem Forever, but today it's a bit easier to deal with what it was lacking at the time, because everything feels like that compared to today's games. I think Daikatana is a game that you should probably check out. Throw a couple bucks at it, check it out, just try it. I mean, John Romero's behind it. That alone should give you a little bit of leeway into at least trying the game. Ultimately, it was a pretty cool experience, a pretty cool game, and it probably deserved a bit more credit than it got. But that's not to say that it's not a fundamentally broken game with a lot of issues, because it certainly is. Fuck those frogs.
May 1997, Mike approached the rest of the board with the idea of starting their own publishing arm, called Ion Strike. The idea was to gain more profits from games released versus having to split royalties with a publisher. Romero didn't feel like this was a necessary step, considering that Ion Storm already had a solid deal in place with Eidos for potentially 6 games, and the budding Ion Storm just didn't have the financial foothold or relations with other developers and publishers to make that kind of move. June 1997. Todd Porter gets word that 7th Level was preparing to go bankrupt. Todd, rather than let his former teammates lose their jobs, wanted to buy the game Dominion, finish it, and then Ion Storm would have a relatively cheap turnaround with one game finished for their IDOS deal. He estimated an additional $50,000 and a few months of work to finish the game, and then he could get back to work on Doppelganger. Mike was enthusiastic about this because it meant that they could burn one of their options and move that much closer to wrapping their IDOS obligations and start their own publishing arm. Romero, however, reminded him that starting the publishing arm could kill their deal with IDOS, and besides, he didn't want to go that route anyway. Todd, however, doesn't see Dominion as a burner option. In emails exchanged between the members of the Ion Storm board, Todd detailed his staunch belief that Dominion had the ability to make sales in excess of 500,000 copies, and listed how other publishers were considering purchasing the game from 7th Level for $1 to $2 million, however, with only minimal royalty in return for the game working on it. Romero doesn't buy the projections. He outright stated that the only reason that they were considering purchasing Dominion would be because it was a burner option. In his opinion, Dominion didn't represent what Ion Storm was all about, especially since the company making it sucked so bad that it was about to go under. Literally, the only reason to buy the title would be to flip it around quickly. While Todd defended the quality of the title, Mike warned Todd against quoting numbers for buying and selling, so as not to accidentally inflate costs. Todd and Mike then end up going at each other, with Todd unhappy that his integrity is being questioned, and Mike telling Todd to quit being an asshole towards Ion Storm employees. June 19th through 21st, 1997. E3 takes place in Atlanta. Romero is hyped to show off the demo of Daikatana, which offers the first look at the Norway chapter of the game. Key Kimbrell has spent the last couple months waist deep in code to get the game ready for prime time. While the demo received some kudos, the real draw of the show was elsewhere. Romero had to go track down what was causing all of the hype, only to discover id Software's booth running a demo of Quake 2. Romero's jaw hit the floor. Colored lighting, 3D acceleration, more complex models. Romero believed that Quake 2 was going to be the best looking game on the market by far. Strictly from a visual standpoint, Daikatana would look like ancient technology if released anywhere near Carmack's latest work. Right then and there, Romero decided that he needed to get the Quake 2 engine for Daikatana. It would mean a slight delay, but in his mind, it didn't seem like too much of a stretch to keep working on the game until he could get the code, and then convert everything over. Later that month, Mike Wilson finds out that the Chase Tower's 54th and 55th floors are empty and primed for Ion Storm's growing team. Romero was hesitant about a space so expansive, especially one which would require intense renovations before moving in, but Mike said that not only would it be perfect, he would get IDOS to pay for it all. And true to his word, he did. IDOS spent the money to build out the top 2 floors, place their offices there, and also have the option of holding key meetings in the space. June 30th, 1997, Next Generation magazine publishes an interview with Romero. During the interview, Romero is asked if he had ever considered going to GT Interactive to have it be Ion Storm's publisher. Rumors suggested that GTI had been Romero's primary landing spot. The Romero comes out in his response.
GT? Why would we go with those guys? I wouldn't go with GT. I don't want to be associated with a company that doesn't care about games or quality.
Perhaps Romero was feeling slightly defensive, recalling the day that he was handed his resignation papers, recalling that it was a little too coincidental that it was immediately after he'd had a meeting with Ron Chamberlains of GTI. Or perhaps it was because he'd been disappointed with the company on his second inquiry during the published recording phase. Regardless, Romero's response in this article is a prime example of the Romero persona at work. Summer 1997. Stevie Case, while working at a tech support position, receives a phone call from Romero. He's recently become the chairman of the Cyber Athlete Professional League, founded in Dallas, and knowing both her skill and celebrity status, Romero wanted her to be their first pro gamer. Stevie, elated, says yes. She quickly ascended the ranks on a trail to victory and stardom, earning sponsorships from mouse and joystick manufacturers, as well as a $1,000 a month stipend from the CPL. For Stevie Case,
everything's coming up Millhouse.
August 1997, Ion Storm purchased Dominion for $1.8 million. Meanwhile, Romero got word from Kevin Cloud that Quake 2 was on track to release by Christmas 1997, and that Romero ought to receive the Q2 code in early 1998. Buoyed by this news, Romero has his team continue to work with their current technology, confident that they'll be able to convert it one-to-one quickly and efficiently. Meanwhile, Romero also got word that Warren Spector and his team at Looking Glass had been cut loose from the developer and were in need of a new home to continue working on their latest game. This game was a sci-fi counter-terrorist immersive sim, which would eventually be titled Deus Ex. Romero called him up and told him not to sign with anyone else, then drove down to Austin to chat with Spector. He sold Spector on the idea of joining Ion Storm, telling him that he would have all the time and all the money he needed to make the game he wanted to make with no producers butting in to tell him what to do. For Spector, this was an absolute dream, so he signed on and his team became the Austin branch of Ion Storm. Soon after this, Mike took a trip out to the UK for a trade show and a meeting with Eidos. In a bold move, he laid out all 6 games that Ion Storm had on deck as options for Eidos to publish. There was the currently in production Daikatana, Dominion, Anachronox, and Deus Ex, as well as the upcoming Doppelganger and Daikatana 2. He said to Eidos, "Take them or leave them." Now, again, putting it mildly, this was a bold move. Eidos felt boxed into a corner. They could accept the offer and throw more funding at Ion Storm for games not even in development yet, or pass on options, freeing Ion Storm of contractual obligations. With Ion Storm already behind on their first 3 games, the deal felt engineered solely to force Eidos to pass on options. Eidos told Mike that they would think it over, and then called Todd Porter, pissed that Mike would put them in such a situation. Todd smoothed it over, then met with Romero and Tom to do damage control. Slowly but surely, Mike had been getting out of hand. He'd been pushing too hard to get Ion Storm out of Eidos' deal and start up Ion Strike. And on top of that, both Mike and Bob Wright were reportedly spending excessive amounts of company money without keeping clear tabs. Frustrated, Romero and the others sat down with Mike and told him to knock it off. Ion Strike wasn't going to happen. Eidos was their publisher. He needed to get back in line with what the rest of the company was trying to do and stick to the plan. September 1st, 1997, Romero compiled Daikatana Milestone 2 to show off progress on the game to Eidos. As Romero wrote in documentation,
"Here is the second Daikatana milestone comprised of 3 levels from the 4 episodes, 12 in total, and many of the monsters, weapons, and artifacts that will be found on those levels when Daikatana is in its final form. At this time, we have finished close to half of all the monsters that will be found in the game, as well as almost half of all the weapons. We have finished more than half of the artifacts in the game and 1/3 of all the levels. None of the monsters' AI is finished, but it uses the fundamental AI engine right now."
It's actually quite impressive just how much of this content would end up in the finished game. There are a number of ideas and items here that don't end up transitioning to the final product, such as the Discus launcher and the Midas Touch glove, but from level architecture to specific textures, Romero has on hand so much of the base layer of the game that it truly does feel that, had he not chosen to move to the Quake 2 engine, he could have made that Christmas 1997 promise. So much work has been done here. So much more than was on display in the March 97 pre-alpha, and it all feels good to play. Someone leaked this version to the internet around 2005, and with Romero's blessing, was made available to download. The basic Quake game feel is here, with solid movement, level design, even the rudimentary shooting is as good as it gets. Say what you will about Romero during this period of time, but his ability to sit down and get to work was above and beyond anyone else on the market. Milestone 2 is an incredible achievement in game development, and makes one wonder what could have been if the game had maintained the use of the Quake 1 engine. Fall 1997. Mike sat down Romero and Tom with news. No one in either of their teams liked Todd or Jerry. Reports from Ion Storm developers were that both men were abrasive, stern, or outright rude. Todd specifically had been ruling and running the roost with militaristic fervor, yelling and screaming at employees, all of whom were viscerally upset with how he treated them. Todd would sometimes even demand that artists on the Daikatana team go on a coffee run for him. Up until now, neither Romero nor Tom had wanted to be involved in day-to-day politics. choosing instead to keep their heads down and involved in development. But they both had their own misgivings with Todd, due to minor clashes over leadership styles and boundaries. Romero also didn't like that Todd had been overstepping and giving directions to his team on Daikatana. The three of them agreed. Todd needed to go, but Romero had second thoughts, nervous over the potential impact that this would have on their relationship with Eidos, and how firing an owner would go. It was a pretty sticky situation. Todd had, thus far, been on good terms in communication with Eidos, where Mike had clearly been pushing buttons while pushing to develop Ion Strike. After the last meeting with Eidos, Romero wasn't sure how it would look to fire Todd and keep Mike. Rather than oust Todd, Romero sat him down instead with a come-to-Jesus talk. He issued a stern warning on how to communicate with employees, and that being mean was no way to run a game company. During this conversation, he let Todd know that they were ready to fire him, but instead was giving him a second chance. Afterwards, Romero and Tom lament to each other that they need to be working on games, not intercompany conflict. December 1997, Quake 2 launches to critical and public acclaim. Meanwhile, Romero got word from a friend at Ritual Entertainment that they had seen a fax detailing the formation of a new publishing company, Gathering of Developers, aka God Games, and the two founders attached to it were then CEO of Ritual Entertainment, Harry Miller, and one Mike Wilson. On top of this, Todd brought word to Romero that Mike had spent $30,000 of company money to buy himself a new BMW without authorization. Furious with all of this, Romero met with Tom and Todd, and they all agreed that Mike was done. Romero drove Mike down to their lawyer's office and fired him. Despite Mike's claim that the loan for the car was on the up and up and approved by the company's financial officer, the forming of a new publishing company while still at Ionstorm was potentially a breach of contract with Eidos, which Romero and the others couldn't have, reflecting poorly on the rest of the company. Fortunately, Eidos was more relieved that Mike was gone rather than upset with Ionstorm. Unfortunately, however, Ion employees were frustrated with Mike's firing, as he had been easy to work with and understanding of their woes within the company. Mike was a believer in the concept that game developers operated on loyalty, and that treating them with kindness and respect got not only better work done on games, but kept valuable employees from seeking jobs elsewhere. On top of all of this, Romero learned that his team was deeply unhappy with having to switch from Quake 1's engine to Quake 2, worried about losing progress on work already done and potentially needing to backtrack. They want to stick with Quake 1's engine, but Romero refused. After Romero demoed Daikatana and Quake 2 side by side, the team saw and understood Romero's concerns. Their game would look horribly dated by comparison. Then, shortly after, Mike's bitch ad finally dropped in gaming magazines. Public opinion immediately turned sour. Forums, opinion pieces, relations with other devs, everything in reaction to the ad was negative. It was and remains quite possibly the most infamous advertisement in computer gaming history. A few people thought it was amusing, but the deathmatch trash talk vibe that the ad went for rubbed a majority of the gaming public the wrong way. People hated the ad and the ego behind it. John Romero is gonna do what to me? Suck what down? Almost overnight, all of the goodwill that Ion Storm had been building disappeared. In a .plan file on December 12th, 1997, the Romero came out to speak on the subject, writing,
"Sorry if I offended your tender sensibilities by telling you I'm gonna make you my bitch."
Followed by a smiley face. Perhaps Romero thought that by committing to the bit he could salvage some of the public's goodwill. It didn't work.
Daikatana released with many issues, and it remains tainted in people's minds because of that. But thanks to the efforts of the modding community, it's now possible to fix or mitigate most of those issues. And what's hidden underneath all of the AI and balancing problems is actually some of the coolest level design and the most ambitious and imaginative shooter design of that whole period. It's a journey that's well worth taking, in my opinion, and deserves to be remembered for more than just its unfortunate launch.
January 1998. The Ion Storm offices on the top of the Chase Tower, dubbed the Willy Wonka Chocolate Factory of Gaming, was finally complete and the teams moved in. Renovations had been done by the Russ Berger Design Group, whose goalpost was to fuse high-end technology with comfort and sophistication. The main conference room was lined with bullet-resistant glass and roll-down metal doors. There was a game room, a deathmatch arena, 12 TV sets constantly playing MTV, and a massive kitchen. Above the deathmatch arena was a motion capture stage as well as a sound-isolated video screening theater. However, in a massive oversight, it quickly became apparent that the wall-to-ceiling glass windows caused too much glare for the workers, and no one could see their screens. The solution became installing screens around the windows and tents around cubicles of those most affected. Meanwhile, Todd Porter was appointed CEO of IonStorm in Mike's wake. Dominion was finally close to being finished and nearly ready to ship. Romero and Tom put their heads down and hit the grindstone hard. Once upon a time, the two men had embarked on a no excuses press tour to promote their game company. Now, they were facing no excuses to continue to be distracted from actually making the games they'd promised to make. February 1998. IonStorm's spending is out of control. Renovations had cost $2.5 million. Dominion's cost was $3 million and rising. Between office lease, salaries, and expenses, IonStorm was spending $1.2 million a month. On top of that, Carmack's code for Quake 2's engine was so radically different and complex that Romero's plan for a quick conversion was dashed. Key Kimbrell looked at what they needed to do to convert their already completed efforts over to the Quake 2 engine and simply said, "It's going to be a lot of work." Some members of the team wanted to just stick with Quake 1's engine, but Romero wouldn't have it. His game needed to rise above the rest. Quake 2 was doing solid sales and had emerged to impressive reviews. Daikatana couldn't release behind that curve. Romero and the rest of the team took note of the extra work necessary, outlined a plan, and informed IDOS of the schedule changes. Around this time, Ben Goki of Raven Software let Romero know that he and some of the devs who had worked on Heretic and Hexen were looking to start their own studio and wondered if IonStorm had any opportunities for them. Romero latched onto the idea of them developing a prototype for Daikatana 2 using the Unreal Engine. Romero secured $250,000 for the team to get to work, and Human Head Studios was born. Romero gave a press announcement about Daikatana 2, as well as comic book adaptations to be released for each IonStorm game, but IDOS quickly swooped in and shut down the idea. As IDOS put it, "We're paying you to make games, not comic books." While a Daikatana tie-in comic would eventually be released, the other comics, as well as Daikatana 2, were dismissed. Human Head, however, would continue onward and receive the blessing of Epic Games to continue working with the Unreal Engine even though they didn't have a dedicated development project. Human Head would eventually settle on a Viking-themed action game and would develop Rune, which released in October 2000. Spring 1998. The mood in the offices was bleak. 12-hour days, 6 days a week, chaos and mishaps seemed to flow one right after the other. A series of levels were deemed unusable. A single arrow texture was made at 1,000 times the wrong size. One dev began screaming at his desk and was fired on the spot. Meanwhile, employees were becoming increasingly frustrated with Todd and Jerry. Todd was showing up at Daikatana meetings and making suggestions, all while Dominion was looking worse and worse. Meanwhile, IonStorm met with IDOS to propose the publisher purchasing part of the company in order to forgive the already spent $15 million, but IDOS was only interested in the deal if they got majority control. And if the deal went through, IonStorm's royalties would also be lowered from 40% to 25%. On May 13, 1998, Sver Kavernmo, Will Lecanto, and 6 other members of the Daikatana team sat down with Bob Wright to air their grievances. After the departure of Mike, the devs saw Bob as an ally. The team wanted to issue an ultimatum. Romero needed to fire Todd and Jerry, or they would walk. It was as simple as that. Bob, in an attempt to keep the peace, encouraged the team to put everything down in writing and present it to Romero himself. However, when Tom got word of the meeting after the fact, what he was told was that Bob had allegedly promised the team that he would financially support them if they either got fired or quit IonStorm as a result of not being heard. Tom called up Romero, who was in the maternity ward with his wife, who had just given birth to his daughter, Lilia. Furious over this news, Romero fired Bob immediately, and then Bob was formally dismissed on the 19th. Bob Wright then turned around and sued IonStorm for wrongful termination and breach of fiduciary duties, claiming that he was fired in order for them to cut him out of the IDOS deal, which was expected to close on June 4th. With all the chips still falling into place and knowing that Todd was increasingly becoming more and more of a bigger problem than they've realized, Romero and Tom told Todd that he needed to, quote, fucking cool it, but they did little else as they didn't have the leverage to vote him out or the money to buy him out of the company. Returning to his team, Romero attempted to address the situation and reassure his crew, promising to do his best to ensure that there would be no more problems. They didn't quite buy it, but they also didn't have much choice but to soldier on. June 1998. Daikatana has a less than stellar reception at E3 in the wake of the bitch ad. Dominion then releases a week later to disastrous reviews, unable to compare to the massive hit StarCraft, which had released a few months prior in March. Todd set about resuming development on Doppelganger, but Eidos stepped in and pumped the brakes. After all the money poured into Dominion, only to result in dismal sales and critical failure, Eidos wasn't ready to pour more money into a Todd Porter product. The Dominion team was then split up between Daikatana, Anachronox, and Deus Ex. Meanwhile, fans were lashing out against Ironstorm, no longer enamored with Romero's Dream Factory. Part of this is due to the rumor mill website called Bitch X, which was leaking inside info about Ironstorm onto the web, including details of the proposed IDOS deal. Todd, bitterly ensconced within the role of CEO now that Doppelganger is cancelled, furiously tried tracking down the leak to no avail. Romero couldn't get anyone to admit to being the leak either. On the warpath, Todd gets his tech guy to attempt to track employee emails, but nothing comes out of this either. Meanwhile, developers are becoming even more embittered with Todd's abusive managerial style. Key Kimbrell voices his concerns surrounding the leak and the company's direction while out on the development floor, which Romero tries to shut down. He tells Key that he's doing nothing but listening to frivolous rumors, but Key refused to remain quiet. After a heated conversation between the two, Key Kimbrell was fired on the spot. July 1998, Stevie Case gets a job as a game tester at Ironstorm. At this point in time, Stevie was an accomplished level designer, with a deathmatch level in the Wages of Sin expansion pack and work on an unreleased mission pack for Quake 2. She's also been working on writing for Prima Publishing's strategy guides, having contributed to the Quake 2 strategy guide and outright written the full guide for Jazz Jackrabbit 2. Looking for work in the industry beyond the Cyber Athlete League, she interviewed for a QA position at Mike Wilson's God Games. However, despite being offered the gig with God, she saw online that Ironstorm was also hiring for QA. Even though the Ion gig was paying considerably less, that was the environment that she wanted to work in. After interviewing with the lead designer and QA manager, Stevie got the job. Excitedly, she shows up for the gig raring to go, thoroughly enamored with the Dream Factory on site. At this point, Romero's Daikatana team was still working 12-hour days 6 days a week, so she packed a suitcase and lived under her desk for 2 weeks while acclimating. August 1998, Romero and his wife Beth separate. That same month, a bizarre headline claimed that John Romero had passed away. In a .plan file, Romero addressed the controversy, pointing out that the article used a headshot from an entirely different photo shoot, one where Romero had been made to look like a corpse through creative makeup, which only made the myth seem more real. No one had been able to get a hold of him or Ironstorm reps before running the article. No matter how many times Romero refuted the story, it continued to pop up throughout the rest of the year. August 21st, 1998. Romero compiles Daikatana version 0.10, which is the first one using the Quake engine. As described on the Cutting Room Floor website, this prototype is notable in that it was compiled about a month before the game's first team resigned. This makes it one of the last glimpses of the game as it was envisioned by the original team. 0.10 shows the game at a much closer state to the final game than it was in Milestone 2. It uses the Quake 2 engine like the final game does. Most of the weapons and enemies from the final game are in this prototype, though many enemies lack textures and cannot be fought in the prototype. A great amount of the art in 0.10 appears in the final game. Many of the levels in the prototype can be found in the final game, but not without alterations. Even a rough version of the final game's menu system is in place. There are many signs that the game needed a lot more work done to it before it could be shipped, though. Weapons and enemies are missing sounds, with one enemy still using temporary sounds she was using in Milestone 2. Enemy AI is primitive, and several enemies do not have the unique behaviors they have in the final game. Levels have few enemies, little items, and in some cases, goals for the player to work towards. The AI partners do not appear at all, despite being a core component of the game. Most items, such as many of the armors, are absent. The cutscene system consists of a handful of scripts and temporary sounds instead of anything shippable. To top it off, there are some technical issues that can cause serious problems if the player goes through several unique levels in a row. October 1998. The IDOS deal falls through. Eidos isn't willing to commit because they had very large concerns with the development of Daikatana, as well as the performance of Dominion. Todd suggests that the company countersue Bob Wright, believing that Bob must have been the one leaking information to Bitch X, therefore costing Ionstorm a multi-million-dollar deal. However, during his communications with the rest of the board, Todd unintentionally posts his emails over to the company server. Emails which detail grumblings about certain Ionstorm employees while casually deriding others who had been laid off. Over at God Games, Mike Wilson was negotiating the rights to create a first-person shooter based on the Todd McFarlane Kiss Psycho Circus comic books. However, Mike didn't have a development team in place that could actually work on the game. Almost by coincidence, the members of the Daikatana team, who had previously sat down with Bob Wright to try and oust Todd from the company, gave Mike a call. They were still unhappy. They still didn't like Todd, and they still remembered Mike being someone who tried to take care of them. While he had them on the phone, Mike had an idea. He was currently in the midst of a disagreement with Todd, as Mike had pointed out that a previously agreed upon deal for Ionstorm partners was that the company would pay the taxes of any of Ionstorm's founders. He hadn't yet had his taxes paid for when he'd been shown the door, and now Mike wanted the agreement honored. Todd said, "Okay, Ionstorm will take care of your taxes, so long as Mike signs an agreement that released all claims that Mike might ever have against Ionstorm." Mike agreed, but only if the company also released all claims that they might ever have against him. With this in mind, Mike proceeded to negotiate a deal with the Daikatana team, letting them know that once the tax check was written out and the agreement signed, the 8 members of the team, henceforth known as the Ion 8, could turn in their resignations. November 18th, 1998, the Ion 8 have their statements prepared, resignations ready to go. But Todd Porter leaves work early. The agreement wasn't signed. Mike hastily sent out an email to the 8, letting them know to hang on just a little bit longer. That night, Stevie Case and a few other employees at Ionstorm take Romero out to dinner at P.F. Chang's. They've kept their ears to the ground, and now they've got some worrisome news and want to make sure he hears it from them. 8 members of the Daikatana team are planning to walk out the next day. They're hoping that Romero can do something about it before it happens. Frustrated with everything going on, Romero says,
"Fuck them if they're gonna leave."
November 19th, 1998. At 10 a.m., Todd signs the agreement, and Mike gets his check. Will Lecanto then received an email from Mike with the code phrase, "The monkey has landed." All 8 members stood up from their desks, called Romero and Tom, and they went into a meeting to inform the two that they were handing in their resignations. All 8 leave Ionstorm. Romero was upset, knowing that he had had multiple opportunities to nip this resentment in the bud, but somewhere deep down, he'd convinced himself that it was the team that wasn't enough of a fit for what he needed. Pushing forward, he hires a group of new members to work on Daikatana and promotes Stevie to a level designer position. Winter 1998. After months of working together, Romero and Stevie have grown close. Romero once thought that he could have it all. He could be the gamer god and the family man, balancing everything he wanted and everything that he thought he wanted. But the problem, the harsh truth, was that family kept coming in second place for him. Stevie understood this. She understood him. And not only that, but she wasn't separate from the gaming. Gaming was her passion too. One night after dinner, while sitting on the curb and sipping wine, Romero and Stevie realized that they were falling for each other. The two of them begin seeing each other and try to keep the relationship on the down low so it doesn't interfere with development, but it doesn't stay secret for very long. In fact, once word gets out, everyone seems ecstatic. Romero and Stevie seem to revel in it. They're the it couple, computer gaming's first rock star duo brought together by the industry and out to change the industry. Magazines, internet, fans everywhere can't get enough of them. January 1999. Romero hires Chris Klee and Stephen Ash from LucasArts to be the new lead level designer and lead programmer respectively. Between the two of them, levels are radically redone and the engine starts coming together with new effects. Ionstorm announces, come hell or high water, Daikatana will be done on February 15th, 1999. January 14th, 1999, the Dallas Observer releases an article called Stormy Weather, which detailed the intense, dramatic, and toxic goings-on at Ionstorm. Leaked emails were the primary source for the article, as well as interviews with Mike Wilson and Bob Wright. The Observer detailed the behind-the-scenes drama of the departure of the Ion 8, as well as other goings-on. As part of the article, Todd was interviewed. He dutifully stated that Ion Storm was expecting Daikatana to sell somewhere close to 2 million units and downplays the departure of the 8, claiming that some of them were going to be phased out of the company sooner versus later anyway. Romero attempted to sue the Observer for their sources, but only ended up discovering that Todd's emails had been accidentally posted to a public server, and therefore anyone could have accessed them. February 15th, 1999, Daikatana misses shipping. March 1999, Ion Storm releases a multiplayer-only demo of Daikatana, but fans aren't impressed. They want to be able to play through the campaign, not just a demo that can only be played through mPlayer. After several failed showings of his game in a row, Romero is getting frustrated. He knows the game is going to be worthwhile. He just needs to land that one dazzling showcase. On April 20th, 1999, the Columbine shooting occurred. Video games, particularly Doom, came under heavy scrutiny and criticism from the public and the government. Romero observes all of this with a heavy heart, and while he personally isn't drawn into the events or mentioned by name, both Doom and id Software are, so everything involved resonates with him. May 1999. Romero and Stevie arrive at E3 in Los Angeles together, dressed to impress as the hot rock and roll gaming couple prepared to show off the latest demo of Daikatana for the crowd. By now, Stevie, a former tomboy, a lover of jeans and baggy sweaters, has slowly become emboldened in her physicality. A year before, a sexy Halloween costume had gotten her attention that she was previously unaccustomed to, but she liked it. Over time, the jeans and sweaters she normally wore transformed into leather and leopard print. Her brunette hair became bleached, and she had her breasts surgically altered. Stevie even poses for multiple magazines, both gaming mags and those eager to sell copies using a hot gamer girl. Stevie is elated with becoming more comfortable with her new looks and feeling herself in every way possible. But despite this, more and more waves of toxic masculinity continue to hit her from every angle. Before, she was accustomed to receiving that negativity from the fact that she was just a woman in gaming. Now, increasingly, it's because she's a sexy woman in gaming. Once upon a time, she was called a feminazi gorilla. Now she was being called a slut, who only had her job from sleeping with her boss. The new build of Daikatana was intentionally designed to win back favor after the mediocre response to the multiplayer-only demo, and had just arrived via FedEx from Dallas to Los Angeles. Romero could feel it. His dazzling showcase had finally arrived, and he was ready to win back the fans. However, when Romero went to install the game, he discovered that the demo was only able to run at an abysmal 12 frames per second, stuttering and chugging and barely playable. Furious, he calls up Chris Klee, who was also furious. It turned out Todd had come down and demanded Klee add a bunch of extra features to the demo without Romero's awareness, delaying the build. Klee, who had been sweating all the way up until the 11th hour working on the build, wasn't able to properly compile the demo before shipping it out. This meant that the demo was attempting to draw the entire map with each individual frame. Romero was out of his mind and raged at Todd. He could have had this, and yet Todd had stepped in yet again and made a mess because he didn't know how to leave things alone. An incensed Klee goes directly to John Kavanagh, VP of Development at Eidos, to complain about Todd's bungling. Upon his return to Dallas, Romero did the same, laying out every single issue ever had with Todd, and said that enough was enough. Todd needed to go. June 1999. Romero, Tom, Todd, and Jerry fly to LA to meet with Charles Cornwall, CEO of Eidos. He informs them that the purpose of the meeting is to address poor leadership at Ion Storm, not the proposed buyout that Todd thinks it is. Romero lays out all of his issues with Todd, and flat out says that either Todd goes or he was going to go. In one of the absolutely coldest statements ever made, Cornwall replied, "The only reason I invested in Ion Storm is because of John. I do not know who Todd Porter is, and I do not care." After a heated conversation, Todd finally agreed to step down. Todd and Jerry are told not to return to the Dallas offices. July 1999. Chris Klee and Stephen Ash leave development to pursue other projects. Romero doesn't blame them. Sean Green is then promoted to lead programmer, the fifth one on Daikatana. September 1999. Eidos buys out 51% of Ion Storm in exchange for forgiveness of previous expenses. October 1999. Romero and the rest of the team hit the final stretch of crunch mode. Staff are fighting for bed space in the lounge. One developer spent 85 out of 90 days in the office. Stevie fell ill with a kidney infection. A sign on the unplugged Tekken 3 arcade machine said, "No more Tekken until Daikatana is finished." While most of the game is completed by this point, the real task of the team is going through and ironing out over 500 bugs and polishing up what they have. October 15th, 1999. Entertainment Weekly publishes an interview with Romero. When asked about the Ion 8 who left, the Romero shows irritation and tries to dismiss the exodus.
This is not a 9-to-5 situation, a place where you put in your time and get out. A lot of people don't know what it takes to make a great game, and we got rid of those people. The people who remain are hardcore.
In the same article, a quote from John Kavanagh reads, "I'll be honest, if it weren't for the design talent here, we'd have shot Ion Storm like a red-headed stepchild." December 17th, 1999. Eidos throws a not-launch party for Daikatana. Despite knowing for some time that the game wouldn't ship in time for the Christmas season, Eidos has had this party scheduled on the books and decides, what the hell? It would probably be more expensive to cancel the party than it would be to have it anyway. Romero decided that this was his opportunity to finally celebrate Ion Storm. In the 3 years that the studio had been around, it had been project after project, setback after setback, and in all of it, only one game had released to terrible reception. There had been no victories thus far. The dream design studio that Romero had once envisioned felt very far away. Maybe Daikatana could still turn it around. So for the one night, he decided to celebrate. January 2000. For the last few months of development, with little drama from either within or without of Ion Storm, progress on Daikatana was as straightforward as any project that has been through this kind of process can be. There were, of course, still articles and interviews and intense scrutiny from the media, but during this period, Romero and his team were nose to the grindstone. It's interesting to think about how Romero had felt like he could get away from the death schedule of id Software's work ethic, how he wanted to enjoy the hard work that he'd put in to reach this point, and could step back slightly and let the gears turn themselves. Yet here he was once again, and had been here for 2 years straight. At this point, he'd lost his wife. He'd lost the respect he'd had from the gaming community and his peers, and he'd come close to losing his company. Daikatana, the game, had become the Daikatana of those D&D sessions only 8 years prior. He had pursued the object at all cost and opened up a swarm of demons and invaders, and here now, in this moment, was doing everything he could to fend them off and still win the day. His entire world was literally at stake once more. He needed Daikatana to succeed. March 2000. Daikatana finally enters beta. Stevie Case, with her experience writing strategy guides, writes the Daikatana strategy guide for Prima Games. As an added bonus for players who pick up the guide, she poses for a pull-out centerfold poster to be included with the book. April 2000. Romero believes that the game is complete. Every map, model, sight, and sound, all done. There's still bug testing to be done, however, and over the course of the rest of the month, numerous bugs are ironed out and removed. May 2000. Stevie poses for Playboy, and the photo shoot is published along with an interview from David Kushner, a journalist who has been following the computer gaming scene for some time, and would eventually go on to write the biography Masters of Doom. Up until this point, Stevie has slowly but steadily done more and more photo shoots in conjunction with either interviews about her work as a level designer or simply articles surrounding anything related to Ion Storm. Gaming magazines were quick to capitalize on Stevie's looks to sell copies. In an issue of PC Accelerator, she dressed as a sexy schoolteacher, complete with a too-tight button-up undone for effect and a short skirt. Perhaps it's simply the atmosphere of the time. Computer games and their advertisements have become more risque in recent years, and are now focusing more on edginess and sex appeal, on booth babes and buxom heroines. Gamers are a horny lot, but there's also the objectification of the hot gamer girl at work. Gamers love a hot chick in theory, but in reality, incel gamer mindsets only distance a woman further from gaming when she's willing to dress in provocative outfits. The last year for Stevie had become increasingly more and more toxic online. Being John Romero's girlfriend and embracing her sexuality drew more detractors and sexism than it did celebration or positive recognition. Romero was constantly asked in interviews what it's like to have sex with her. In articles and interviews for Daikatana, journalists would frequently describe her as voluptuous and smoldering rather than speak on her talents as a designer. Comments and forums and websites focus on her body with the kind of vulgarity that's referred to as locker room talk. But with the Playboy shoot, the toxicity reached a new peak. While Stevie was ecstatic at how both the shoot and the interview turned out, the online commentary was as vile as modern audiences would expect. In fact, it wasn't too far from the current strain of misogynistic incel statements made online today. Degrading, hostile, incendiary, the commentary sticks with Stevie for months, burning into her brain. In a Vanity Fair article from 2022, designer Cliff Basinski would look back at Stevie's time in the industry and note, she was there when there were almost no women in the industry. The amount of shit that she got was just tremendous. In 2000, Stevie Case was an accomplished level designer, writer, and gamer. But no matter what she did during that time, or how she chose to celebrate herself, the gaming public only saw her for her body and her boyfriend. Right after this, Daikatana entered release candidate 18. IDOS looked over the current build, discussed it internally, and decided that the current state of the game was good enough to ship. Romero told himself, this is it. The time has finally come, and the game is going to finally be released. So, how was it received?
Daikatana was the death of the boom shoot. It was like Heaven's Gate for 70s Hollywood auteurs. It went way over time and over budget, and I don't think anyone was happy with the final product. Frustrating and littered with technical issues that made it, if not unplayable, then not at all fun to actually play. The story was dumb, obvious, yet somehow needlessly convoluted. The first episode is the worst part of the game, and it's everyone's first exposure to Daikatana, so nobody wanted to continue playing. They couldn't see how good the player movement was because they couldn't bear to play long enough to level up enough to make it to the more open areas where it could really shine. It took you hours to find a weapon that didn't have a crippling drawback that made using it not fun. Hubris led to exhaustion, led to an unfinished misfire that came out years too late and destroyed John Romero's reputation for decades. I was alive for all the Daikatana jokes, kids, and I would have disappeared too after that kind of backlash. Or not, people don't remember anything for more than a week nowadays. Also, what is this for? Ranger? Who the fuck is...
Daikatana wasn't a major event. It was a punchline. It was savaged both commercially and critically. But again, this was 25 years ago. There's been times where games or movies or books have been released to both critical and commercial failure, and yet were seen later on as cult classics. They were misunderstood at launch and weren't seen for the genius that they really were. Which then means I have to ask the question, was Daikatana truly that bad at release? Or was it simply a misunderstood diamond in the rough? Well, kids, we're not going to dive into that right now. Part 1 of the documentary is coming to a close. However, when we return with Part 2, I'm going to take an unfettered and unfiltered look at how Daikatana was received and also played at launch. You see, if modern gamers were to purchase Daikatana through Steam or GOG nowadays, they would be downloading and playing Daikatana version 1.2. So, from that standpoint, there isn't really a way for us to experience vanilla, unpatched version 1.0 released at launch and really get a glimpse as how it played in the hands of those gamers who purchased it on store shelves. Unless you happen to own a copy of the game on CD-ROM, which I do, meaning that I have installed and played vanilla 1.0 Daikatana with no mods, no patches, and no fixes. So when we return, I am going to do a deep dive on the game, on its mechanics, and whether or not the game is actually as bad as everyone said it was. Thank you all so much for coming on this journey through the rise of Daikatana. I've put hundreds of hours into this project and it has been exhausting. Thrillingly exhausting, but exhausting nonetheless. If you feel so inclined, leave a like and a comment and let me know what you think so far. Maybe even hit that subscribe button if you want to see more. And if you would like to help fund this and future projects of mine, click on the link to my Patreon in the description. Until next time, kids, make sure you sit up straight, get outside a little bit, it's almost summer and the weather is warming up, and above all else, stay hydrated. I'll see you next time for Part 2, The Fall of Daikatana. Take care.